The so-called bravest man in England, Colonel Fred Burnaby was an all-round Victorian action hero who famously met his death fighting the Mahdists at the Battle of Abu Klea in Sudan in 1885. But there's a lot more to Burnaby than simply dying in a colonial battle with the British Army. His life was like a boy's own story. It took him on adventures, travelling through the icy steppes of Central Asia to a land where foreigners were excluded, to being a war correspondent, a record-setting balloonist, a skilled linguist who mastered 7 languages, not bad for a Brit. He was a physical giant, standing at 6 foot 4 inches tall, with a 47-inch chest, who could bend metal bars with his bare hands, and carry ponies under his arm. Celebrated in poems and monuments, a man who fought one of the most famous Victorian politicians in a general election, a best-selling author, as well as a soldier. This is the story of Fred Burnaby, a legend in his own lifetime. Frederick Gustavus Burnaby was born in 1842, the son of a clergyman from a landed family at Somerby Hall in Leicestershire. From this landed background, it was hardly surprising that he was educated at some of the best schools in the country, Bedford, Harrow, Oswestry, before being privately tutored in Germany. And here he learnt German to go alongside his proficient skills in French and Italian. Among many talents, Fred Burnaby had an ear for languages, as you're going to discover. At the age of 17, he was commissioned into one of the elite cavalry units in the British Army, the Royal Horse Guards. Army life gave him the opportunity to excel at a variety of sports. He was a first-rate boxer, but also held his own at fencing, riding and running. Fred Burnaby had the build of a man mountain, standing at 6 foot 4 inches with a 47-inch chest. And he had the strength of a giant too. One of his party tricks was to bend metal pokers with his bare hands. He was also renowned in his regiment for being able to hold a 170-pound dumbbell in one hand straight out in front of him. Once, when he was based at Windsor Castle, his officer friends brought him 2 ponies upstairs to his room for a joke. The joke was on them, however, when the ponies wouldn't go back down the stairs. With potential disciplinary hanging over all of them, Burnaby took each pony under his arms and carried them downstairs. When Queen Victoria heard about this, she commented that she was pleased that someone with Burnaby's strength was guarding her and her castle. He was desperate to see some action, but his regiment was stuck in the British Isles for over a decade. The good news for young Fred was that his elite cavalry unit gave their officers 5 months' leave each year over the winter period. And this approved leave gave Burnaby the opportunity to go off on a series of adventures for the rest of his life. During his annual leave in 1874, he travelled to Spain as a correspondent for the Times newspaper to cover the Carlist Civil War. Here, apart from seeing a war close up, he added Spanish to his list of languages. The dynastic feud was still in progress the following year, but Burnaby had by then decided to broaden his horizons to Africa. Here he travelled to Sudan to meet the Egyptians' British governor of their colony, General Charles Gordon. Travelling to the southern province of Equatoria, roughly modern South Sudan, Fred Burnaby travelled into areas that had hardly seen a European before. It was in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, following his adventures with General Gordon, that Burnaby read an article in a newspaper that fired up the 33-year-old for his next adventure. The Russians had been expanding their empire into Central Asia. These Muslim countries had a long and proud history, and cities like Samarkand and Bukhara and Khiva had built their prosperity as key staging posts on the fabled Silk Road from China to Constantinople. Military strength might have brought them into the Russian Empire, but Russian military control was far from secure. The last thing the Russians wanted were agents of other European powers turning up on the ground and inciting unrest. And so the Russians banned all foreigners from their new territories. To Burnaby, this was the ultimate challenge. Not just travelling to these historic and mysterious cultures, but trying to outwit the Russians in the process. There was one slight problem, apart from the fact that he shouldn't have been there. His annual leave was during the winter months. In other words, His expedition to Central Asia would be in the depth of their winter, where temperatures can drop to minus 35 degrees Celsius. But do you think this would faze a man who could bend metal pokers with his bare hands and carry ponies down staircases? Of course not. On the 30th of November, 1875, he set off on the adventure of a lifetime, and one that would make him a national hero. Now, most people, when they are secretly entering a country which bans foreign travellers, would do it as quietly as possible. Not Burnaby. He arrived at Victoria Station in London carrying an 85-pound pack and headed directly for the Russian capital, St. Petersburg. Using his Russian language skills, he made his way via train and then sledge to the very borders of Central Asia. Before we find out what happens next, if you're enjoying this story, then please give me a like using the icon below. Hiring a local guide and a servant, he set off by camel towards the Silk Road city of Khiva. The Khanate of Khiva, which spread east from the Caspian Sea, had finally been conquered by the Russians at the fifth attempt, just 2 years beforehand in 1873. Now a protectorate of Russia, whilst the Khan, Muhammad Rahim, was nominally independent, in reality he took his orders from St. Petersburg. The little party of three riding through the icy steppes of Central Asia must have made an interesting sight. The now bearded 6'4" Burnaby, wrapped in furs, alongside his servant, who was just 5 foot in height. Word of this strange giant spread rapidly through the countryside, and by the time they reached Khiva itself, a curious throng numbering 300 to 400 people joined his entry into the city. And so, having had a shave, Frederick Gustavus Burnaby met Muhammad Rahim, Khan of Khiva. Whilst the Khan may have been impressed by Burnaby's size, he was even more impressed when the British officer addressed him in Turkish, yet another one of his 7 languages. By now, the English explorer's adventure had come to the attention of the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, Queen Victoria's cousin, the Duke of Cambridge. The young British officer might think it was a lark to be running around a restricted area, but Cambridge could see a diplomatic incident in the making, and he ordered Burnaby back to Britain ASAP. Upon his return to Britain, he was greeted as a hero. Burnaby, with experiences writing for the Times in Spain, could turn a phrase, and promptly published a book all about his adventure. Entitled A Ride to Khiva, it became an instant hit. Here was a real-life swashbuckling hero. The Victorian public couldn't get enough of him. Even Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli praised his writing. The following year, with tensions between the Ottoman Turks and Russia rising as a result of the Bulgarian atrocities, Burnaby once more set off on an adventure, this time travelling from Scutari in Constantinople to Erzurum in the far east of what is now Turkey. From there he moved up to, but this time didn't cross, the Russian border, where he observed Russian military movements. This 1,500-mile round trip on a pony resulted in another best-selling book, On Horseback Through Asia Minor. In 1879, Fred Burnaby married Elizabeth Hawkins Whitshed. She was from an Anglo-Irish family based in Greystones, County Wicklow. The 19-year-old Elizabeth was half his age, and after she gave birth to a son, Harry Burnaby, the following year, she and Fred were to lead increasingly separate lives. Burnaby, the man of action, now tried his hand at politics. Never a man to take the easy option, in the 1880 general election, he was the Conservative candidate in the radical city of Birmingham. There he was up against 2 of the greatest Liberal MPs of their time, the veteran John Bright, and the man who, as Mayor of Birmingham, had almost made the city his own, Joseph Chamberlain. Despite being up against Chamberlain's powerful Liberal election machine, Burnaby, as only Burnaby could, took the battle to his opponents. During one public hustings, he was heckled by 2 Liberal supporters in the front row. Walking to the front of the stage, the gigantic Burnaby leant over, grabbed both men by their collars, lifting them into the air. He then carried them to the back of the stage and plonked them in 2 chairs, and in his loud, commanding cavalry officer voice, barked, "Sit there, little men!" Strangely enough, there was no more heckling at that meeting. Despite fighting a determined and, according to Chamberlain, dirty campaign, Burnaby was unable to beat the 2 sitting Liberal MPs. Whilst failing to enter the House of Commons, Burnaby played an active role in trying to build grassroots support for the Conservative Party. In 1883 he was a founding member of the Primrose League, along with his political ally, Lord Randolph Churchill. Before I continue with the next chapter of Burnaby's life, if you're enjoying this story then please subscribe to my channel so you don't miss future videos here on YouTube. There is a saying that when one door closes, another door opens, and that was certainly the case for Fred Burnaby. Just 2 years later, he was once again in the headlines with his latest daring do. This time, he took to the air. Fred Burnaby was a long-time fan of hot air or gas balloons. By 1882 it made at least 16 cents. It was now that Burnaby lifted off from a field in Kent all by himself and crossed the English Channel. He successfully landed in a field in Normandy, thus becoming the first Englishman to make a solo crossing of the Channel in a gas balloon. He had now been in the army for 25 years and had risen to the rank of colonel. Amazingly, despite all his adventures, he kept missing out on the ultimate military adventure, going to war. Maybe it was bad luck, or maybe his attention-seeking had put a black mark against his name. I guess we'll never know. It probably didn't help matters that Burnaby had also insulted the Prince of Wales, which had earned him the enmity of the Prince's relative, the Commander-in-Chief of the army, the Duke of Cambridge, a man who had been less than impressed by Burnaby's travels to Khiva. Which brings us to the Sudan Campaign of 1884-85. Once more, Burnaby fell back on his usual tactic to go on an adventure, annual leave, and in 1884 he joined General Graham's Sudan Expedition. With a command of Arabic, yet another one of his 7 languages, Fred Burnaby offered his services as an intelligence officer, which Graham accepted. He was present at the Battle of El Teb, where he was wounded in the left arm. However, the colonel had also raised eyebrows by turning up for the battle with his double-barrel shotgun. Many officers felt it was jolly unsporting to shoot 13 of the enemy as if they were game birds. Another black mark seemed to go against his name. By the end of the year, General Wolseley was gathering an army for the Nile Expedition to rescue Burnaby's old friend Charles Gordon, who was besieged in Khartoum by the Mahdi. Surely this time Burnaby would be picked. Once more he was passed over. It seemed that the Duke of Cambridge was not the sort of man to forgive and forget. It also seems that his fellow officers thought that taking a shotgun to war was simply not cricket. But there was one thing Burnaby could do. He took 5 months annual leave and arrived in Egypt. Wolseley was delighted to have the larger-than-life Victorian adventurer on his team, not least because it would annoy his great rival, the Duke of Cambridge. Despite the fact that Burnaby was not acting in any official capacity, Wolseley appointed him as second-in-command of the Desert Column. Those of you who've watched my videos on the Battle of Abu Klea and also the one about the Nile Expedition will know something about the Desert Column, so here is just a summary. With General Charles Gordon now besieged in Khartoum, the British government had ordered General Sir Garnet Wolseley to rescue him. Wolseley's plan was to march up the River Nile all the way from Egypt to Khartoum. Due to a variety of reasons, mainly the distance and some of Wolseley's own creating, this river column was making slow progress. With messages from Gordon becoming more and more desperate, Wolseley decided to send a small force on a shortcut across the desert to speed up the relief effort. This desert column, consisting principally of British troops mounted on camels, was commanded by Major General Sir Herbert Stewart. As I mentioned earlier, Burnaby was appointed as his number 2. As the 1,500-strong British column made their way across the desert, they found their way blocked by a huge army of Mahdists, numbering around 14,000, near the wells at Abu Klea. If you want to know the details about the Battle of Abu Klea, there's a link in the description below. Stewart formed the column into a dismounted square and ordered it to advance. The Mahdists launched a ferocious attack on the square. Burnaby had been ordered by Stewart to the back of the square to oversee but not command the rear rank. As the Mahdists rushed towards the British position, the commander of the Naval Brigade, Captain Lord Charles Beresford, decided to move his Gardner gun out of the square to open up the machine gun on the advancing enemy. It was now that Burnaby made a critical error. ordering 2 companies of the Heavy Camel Regiment to wheel out of the square to let Beresford through. Beresford's machine gun didn't have the desired effect, jamming after 70 rounds, and before the men of the Heavy Cavalry Regiment had managed to wheel back into the line, the Sudanese Mahdists had rushed into the square. Accounts vary as to whether Burnaby was directing the reformation of the square, or whether he had spotted some men stranded and had gone to their rescue. Either way, Burnaby was suddenly surrounded by the Mahdists. An accomplished fencer, he contemptuously parried the attempts of a warrior to attack him with an 8-foot spear. Suddenly, another Sudanese warrior ran up from behind him and thrust his spear into Burnaby's shoulder. Eyewitnesses say it was just a glancing blow, but it fatally distracted him. As Burnaby looked over his shoulder at the new attacker, the original man thrust his spear into Burnaby's throat. With blood pouring from him, Burnaby warded off further blows, before weakly falling to the ground. Corporal Mackintosh, a fellow Royal Horse Guard, ran to his rescue, only to be killed in the process. Another soldier, Private Steele, clubbed his way through the Mahdists, and then stood over the mortally injured Burnaby for the next few minutes, until the British were able to reform their square and drive the Sudanese from the field. As the British advanced across the battlefield, they found a young soldier, Private Wood, holding the dying Burnaby in his lap. The soldier looked up at an officer with tears in his eyes and said, "Oh, sir, here is the bravest man in England, dying, and no one can help him." There was nothing they could do. Apart from the serious cut to his throat, the top of Burnaby's head had almost been cleft off by a Mahdist sword. As they gathered around the fallen Burnaby, hardened Victorian soldiers burst into tears. Such was their esteem for this all-action Victorian hero. Colonel Fred Burnaby died shortly afterwards, and is buried at the battlefield in Sudan, along with the other 80 British fallen. Victorian Britain mourned the loss of an all-round hero. It is said that Queen Victoria fainted when she heard the news. Poets paid tribute in verse, the most famous being Sir Henry Newbolt. "The sand of the desert is sodden red, red with the wreck of the square which broke. The Gatling's jammed, the colonel's dead, and the regiment blind with dust and smoke." Meanwhile, William McGonagall, who was at the time described as the worst poet in Britain, made his own contribution. "Oh, it was an exciting and terrible sight, to see Colonel Burnaby engaged in the fight, with sword in hand, fighting with might and main, until killed with a spear thrust in the jugular vein." McGonagall or Newbolt, who's your vote for? Tell me in the comments below. A 50-foot high obelisk was erected to honour Burnaby outside St Philip's Cathedral in Birmingham. With a bust of the great man along with his name, it has just 2 simple inscriptions. The first is Abu Klea, 1885, the site of his valiant death. Appropriately, or some might say ironically, it was unveiled by Captain Lord Charles Beresford, the very man whom Burnaby had opened the square for so he could run his Gardner gun out. The other inscription simply reads, Khiva, 1875. Khiva, the fabled city on the Silk Road, the journey to which had turned Burnaby into a national hero. And this memorial sits in the city where he fought such a valiant political battle against Joseph Chamberlain and John Bright. The monument was actually unveiled in the very month of the next general election, November 1885. A general election in which local Conservatives had wanted Burnaby to represent them again. Instead, that mantle fell to his friend and political ally, Lord Randolph Churchill. He, like Burnaby, would be defeated by Joseph Chamberlain. Chamberlain would go on to become colonial secretary when Sudan was finally conquered by General Kitchener in 1898, and also during the Boer War. Burnaby's wife Elizabeth was to marry 3 times and become a pioneer in alpine mountaineering. Their son Harry died in Washington DC in 1938. Author Clive Williams raises the interesting idea that Burnaby's adventurous life provided the inspiration for George MacDonald Fraser's stories about Harry Flashman. But unlike the fictional Flashman, Burnaby was certainly no coward, and by all accounts, not a cad either. But there is a famous painting of Fred Burnaby early in his career in which there is a more than a passing resemblance to the front covers of the Flashman books. Whether or not this is true, there is no doubt that the 6'4" 20-stone Burnaby was in all respects a larger-than-life character. Soldier, adventurer, balloonist, writer, politician, strongman, speaker of 7 languages including Russian, Arabic and Turkish. It's not a bad record. Even without Abu Klea, he was a legend in his own lifetime. Colonel Fred Burnaby, 1842 to 1885. They don't make them like that anymore. Actually, they didn't make too many of them like that, even in Victorian Britain. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that video. Who or what would you like to hear about in the future? Please drop me a line. More videos from Victorian military history coming your way. But until then, thanks for your support, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.